This is Digaris book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. Email profhugodigaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodigaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 7, part 6, chapter title Forces Opposing Glober. Going straight on. Section I, Cultural Inertia. My first country was Australia, the culture I grew up in. I left it in the early 1970s and have only visited about once a decade since, mainly to see family. In 1972, 79, 86, 98 and 2007. So I see the culture in quantum jumps in time. It's interesting for me to observe how the culture has changed, and even more interesting to observe how the culture has not changed. As I explained in chapters 2 and 3 on the pros and cons of the various countries I've lived in, I did not like Australia. At the time I chose to leave it in the early 1970s as a young man. It was a provincial-minded backwater of a culture, an Anglo-Saxon colony stuck away in Southeast Asia, based on British lower-class values and utterly non-intellectual. For me it was as bland as grey paint, and as uninterested in ideas and intellectual activities as it was enthusiastic for sporting events, a combination that left me alienated and suffocated. Each time I return to the country, I observe it with a cold, critical eye to see to what extent it has changed. On a recent trip undertaken during the same year as this book was written, that's 2007, I could see the impact that several decades of fairly healthy economic growth had had upon the culture. Most upper middle-class Australians had travelled overseas to Europe, the US and elsewhere. The biggest impact seemed to me to be due to the internet, but that would be true of any rich country. At the time of writing, about 70% of Australians use the internet, which is a figure comparable with Americans. The internet is a worldwide revolution that has changed everyone, as important as the invention of the printing press that sparked off the Reformation in Europe. The Australians seemed happier, wealthier, more sophisticated and more multicultural than they were when I was growing up there. Their standard of living was nearly as high as in the US, and with much better weather. These were pleasant surprises for me, since I had had negative opinions about the culture for nearly 4 decades. However, the old negative attributes were still there to a large extent. The culture was still as mindless as I remember it. There was still the same obsession with sport and the same intellectual sterility that made me treat the country with such contempt that I left it as a young man, and then, a decade later, divorced my first wife because she insisted on returning to her native Australia. I really did not want to live there. So, on my latest, fifth and perhaps last visit, being a lot older and having lived in 10 countries, I began contemplating the concept of cultural inertia. That is, the extent to which cultures remain the way they are, like a heavy flywheel that takes a long time, due to friction, to come to a standstill once the driving force that spun it up is removed. Cultural inertia, or cultural transmittance, is high, because if one thinks about it, how could it be otherwise, unless there exists some powerful new force to change the traditional cultural norms? Take the case of a young mother raising her child. What will that mother teach her child? For example, what language will she teach the child to speak in? Obviously her own language, because that is probably the only language she knows, so the child grows up speaking the same language as the mother. The same argument exists for millions of people living in the same culture. What values will the mother give her child? The answer is similar, that is, the same as her values that she absorbed earlier as a child from her parents. Thus there is a built-in inertia to the maintenance of cultural norms. They continue by default, that is, by lack of an alternative. Usually, the smaller an isolated culture is, the less likely it is that it will change. It will remain mostly static, due to the lack of novel external social forces to influence it to change, and to the lack of creative genii in the culture who invent new ways of doing things. Also, speaking from first-hand experience, too rapid social change can be awfully nerve-wracking. I remember my first weeks in the US as a relatively recent widower, having to cope with a new culture alone. Even though the culture was English language based, there was so much newness, especially in having to set up a household and new job, that a month or so later my hands were shaking. I really wanted the constant pressures of newness, that is, the constant stimulus, to stop, but it didn't. It reinforced strongly in my mind the importance of routine, of normalcy, so that the brain is not too taxed with novelty. Routine is relaxing. It takes less mental effort when doing something that is routine. It takes a lot more mental effort when a task to be undertaken is new. It takes concentration and creativity, decision making, and can require enormous mental energy. When one is concentrating hard, for example, as in an exam, or on stage, or on the media, one can feel utterly exhausted after it's over because the brain has been working so hard. Highly intelligent, stimulus-hungry people tend to like travel because they have the brains to assimilate and relativize the cultural differences they observe, as well as the need for a high stimulus level to stop them from going mentally stale. That's why such people will often say that travelling, that is, flying to some other country or culture, is so refreshing, so clearing away the cobwebs of the mind. So, in light of the above, there's a happy medium to what is desirable for people to have to cope with in terms of cultural change. If there's a lot of it, people get exhausted and over time feel culturally isolated, alienated. In the case of my first Australian wife, for example, she was ready to divorce if I did not return with her to her native culture. So alienated did she feel in continental Europe, away from her cultural roots. So we are talking about powerful psychological forces here. This leads me to the basic question of this section, and that is just to what extent will cultural inertia resist cultural change as powerful new forces push people to a much greater level of multicultural and even global consciousness, thus undermining their traditional national horizons? I can see in the case of my recent visit to Australia how much the parochial mentality of Australians that was the norm only a decade or two ago had changed due to world travel and particularly to the internet. The educated, university-degreed, upper-middle-class Australians were much more cosmopolitan than they were when I first left the country. But what has occurred with the internet in the past decade is small beer in comparison with what is coming in the next few decades. The BRAD, B-R-A-D, bit rate annual doubling, law of telecommunications will keep bit rates doubling for several more decades. So the social changes that will follow due to hugely improved images from the planet will be enormous. People will be able to travel in their living rooms with 3D, real-world quality images. Imagine the impact on people's minds. Images of people in life-size, real-world quality, in terms of resolution and stereo vision, will feel as real as having another person in the living room with you. The emotional impact will be far greater than with today's 2D, flat, far-away feeling images that do not ring true. With the billion-fold faster internet, images from the whole planet will come flooding into one's living room, hugely expanding people's experiential horizons. The range of material that will come flooding in will be thousands if not millions of times greater than the range of choice today. People's minds will be forever modified, made more global in their thinking. For non-English speaking people, pressure will increase on them to learn the global language so that they can absorb most of the images and sounds that they will see with the new internet. The question arises, just how much of this flood can ordinary people cope with? Probably older, less intelligent, less mentally agile people will simply not bother to learn a new language and hence will not be greatly exposed to the new ideas and cultural influences that will be flooding in. Hence the cultural inertia of the older generation will take a generation to disappear, that is, the time needed for them to die off. The young generation, especially those who will be learning English, probably compulsorily, intensively at school and university, will be profoundly changed, but they need to learn how to live anyway due to their premature age. If they are to learn adult attitudes, they may as well learn the global attitudes rather than the narrow monocultured attitudes that were traditional to their parents and grandparents. What about the middle generation? They have already absorbed the traditional attitudes of their monoculture, but still have a generation or two of life left. They will be the ones the most perturbed because they will be conscious that the world has changed around them. They will be conscious that their children live in a much broader mind space and treat their parents as fogies who have not bothered to adapt to the new global reality. It's quite possible that a major generation gap may grow between the middle and young generations, especially when the middle generation does not make sufficient effort to master listening and speaking the global language of English. As the young generation masters English and then becomes global in its mentality, it's quite possible that it will increasingly treat the middle and old generations with contempt. The young generation, exposed to the media of the world and being mentally transformed by it, will come to view the monocultured attitudes and limitations of its parents with real disdain. They will acquire the traditional condescending attitudes that multis have for monos. The younger generation will become multis, or globans, and its parents will remain monos, at least to some extent. See Chapter 10 for more on the generation gap problem due to the influence of glow media. If the cultural change due to the influence of the global media is too great, it's possible that the middle generation, and to some extent the old generation, may rebel. There's a limit to how much cultural change people can cope with each day. I know because I've lived through many cultural changes, in fact 6 of them. Everyone has their limit of tolerance towards the cultural change rate. Hence, the cultural inertia factor is certainly one that will influence the rate at which cultures can change. That is, the rate with which they can globalize due to the global media and the emergence of a global language. Global cultural homogenization cannot be pushed too quickly, otherwise there'll be a backlash. Too many people will be made to feel uncomfortable, hence political resistance to globalization will increase. More dynamic, more energetic cultures, especially those with a higher proportion of younger people, will adapt faster and more fluidly. Older cultures, in the sense of having a top-heavy old-age population, for example Japan and Europe, will have a harder time coping and will globalize their mentalities more slowly, thus missing the boat in terms of reaping the benefits of globalizing the best of the world's cultures into their own culture. But in the case of Japan and Europe, since they're both rich parts of the world, they'll be amongst the first to globalize because they will have the technology to do so. The lesson here for the globus is that global cultural homogenization is not to be pushed too fast. The globus will need to accommodate to the mono's comfort zone with regard to the optimum rate at which they can absorb cultural change. The globus will have to respect the fact that a cultural inertia exists and that it's not to be ignored. If the globus push too quickly, their efforts will only backfire and they will make themselves hated because they will have made too many monos feel uncomfortable and alienated. J. Cultural alienation. One of the major causes of cultural alienation will be one of the major causes of cultural inertia will be cultural alienation. The feeling of not belonging to the culture that one is living in is distressing. Since I've lived in 7 countries, it's easy for me to understand the concept of cultural alienation. I've felt it to varying degrees in all the 7 countries I've lived in. This is probably inevitable. I certainly felt it in my first country, Australia, to such an extent that I uprooted myself from it, said goodbye to family and friends, and set off on a boat to the other side of the earth, to where I expected to have a better life, a culturally more compatible life. I remember watching the wharf slipping slowly over the horizon as the ship steamed northwards to the old world. As the landmass where I had spent my whole young life disappeared, I felt terribly alone for about 3 minutes. Once I'd arrived and settled a bit in London, I felt much happier. I was living in a culture that valued my values, so I felt much less culturally alienated than in the culture I had grown up in. After 6 years in the UK, I conceived the idea of living a more cosmopolitan life on the European continent, learning a string of languages and absorbing the positive features of several superior cultures relative to my first culture, especially French and German cultures. So British, French and German cultures became part of my life. I certainly benefited. I became far more cosmopolitan, more sophisticated, and developed a very strong sense of cultural relativity, but at a price. These new cultures, that is new to me, also had their negative sides as well. They had characteristics that I found alienating and did not like. I listed many of these in chapters 2 and 3. When I moved to Japan for a postdoc, I felt the greatest alienation of all. You may ask when Why then did I stay there so long? Well, there were other compensations. The Japanese were footing the bill on my expensive artificial brain building machine, and I had a Japanese mistress I really appreciated. But the longer I stayed, the more alienated I felt, because I did not feel motivated to integrate. I did not learn to speak the language, nor learn the writing script, so I was unable to make Japanese friends. I did not bother to learn the language because I felt it would be a waste of time, because there would be no payoff, that is, no cultural and especially intellectual reward. I did not respect the Japanese intellectually. I considered them intellectually sterile, greatly inferior to the cultures I had come from, although economically successful. So I knew it would only be a question of time before I'd leave the country. I eventually stayed 8 years there, which is a long time for a Westerner. I'm now starting to feel a growing alienation living in China, ad-libbing now. So I wrote this, 10 years ago, in 2007. It's now, as I speak, it's 2017. So I arrived in China 2006. I'd been a year or so in China at the time of writing. China is not rich and has, I am suspecting increasingly, a culturally ingrained tendency not to treat people as individuals with basic human rights. There's a mean-spiritedness in the Chinese mentality that I truly loathe. It's early days for me in China, well then. So, ad-libbing, bottom line, I'm out of this shithole. I've totally lost patience and tolerance for China and the Chinese. By the time I leave, it will have been about 12 years in China, which is a long time. The culture is simply just unfit for Westerners to live in. Just too many massive inferiorities. Back to the book. It's early days for me in China, so I can't yet balance the inferiorities of China with its fabulous potential. At the time of writing, I've only been living in China for a year. So, I can speak with first-hand experience about how cultural alienation feels. I lost my first wife and 2 children due to the cultural alienation she felt in Brussels. If a woman is prepared to divorce and render her children fatherless rather than stay in a culture that she feels alienates her, then that shows pretty clearly how strong an antagonism can become when one lives in a culture that does not make one feel at home. That is, one that does not feel familiar nor part of oneself. In fact, I think I can claim that I lost 3 wives, in quotes, to cultural alienation. My second wife was Belgian-French and seemed quite happy in her native culture, but when she moved with me to Japan, she withered. After she died of lung cancer, so readers who smoke, take note, cigarettes will kill you. My Japanese mistress did not want to live in the US, where I was living, so that relationship also ended. Ad-libbing, actually, she said she would live in America so long as I paid for her. So the masculist in me exploded, so I just told her to fuck off and go back to Japan. That was the end of that relationship. I suspect that women, being more interested in social and personal matters than men, on the whole, do not transpose culturally as well as men. Probably women need social interaction more than men, and suffer more when they get less of it when they change cultures than do men. At least that's my impression. It's certainly true for my individual case. So considering how powerful the need is to feel culturally rooted, the globists will simply have to accept that most people will want to stay in their own culture, the one they grew up in, and feel at home in. Most people will not want to be subjected to huge cultural changes that disorient them to such an extent that their mental health is jeopardized. There's a risk that mass cultural alienation may occur once millions of people in a population choose to move on, having been exposed to a global media. Differences exist in levels of adaptability to the new global cultural influences and ideas. The young generation will adapt the fastest, so will be the more intelligent, and so will the more intelligent and stimulus-hungry sector of the population of any age. But what about the rest? They will not take kindly to having their traditional attitudes and respect levels lowered. They will not like being sneered at and labelled monos by the multis and globans and the young generation. They will look back to the time when nearly everyone was a mono, and to the time when the very term and concept of the mono did not exist. Now they are labelled and thought to be inferior due to their narrow attitudes and horizons. They feel alienated by the people around them, who are not only very different from them in terms of their interests and attitudes, but worse, treat them as inferior. This will not make the monos happy at all and may lead to a strong resentment and a collective political backlash. So, as in the previous section, the globists need to be conscious that they cannot push too hard or too fast in their aims at creating a global homogeneous culture. It's simply a fact at the time of writing that people live in monocultures and that the values and norms of those separate cultures are deeply ingrained in the mentalities of the peoples who live in them. These mentalities cannot be changed overnight, nor in years, perhaps not even in decades, although I doubt it'll be as slow as that. It may take many years for the globists to learn from experience at what rate they can safely push for a global state. My guess is, even with a global media and a global language, it will take many more decades before people feel sufficiently comfortable with a homogenized global culture to accept the creation of a global state. Creating a global state will require a massive dose of cultural engineering, whether conscious and explicit or unconscious, unplanned and emergent, due to the many globalizing forces mentioned in Chapter 5. K. Anarchist opposition. I have a certain sympathy towards the philosophy of the anarchists and the libertarians. The basic idea of the anarchists is that there should be no governments, that people should organize their own communities to govern themselves. The libertarian view of history is that governments have always oppressed the people they govern by exploiting them, killing them in wars, brainwashing them to do what the governments want, etc. I certainly learned to hate the first government I grew up in. It conscripted me to go to the Vietnam War. I was then 20 years old, and my marble came up in the conscription birthday lottery. I felt a certain sympathy with the Viet Cong in their fight to decolonize their country from the colonial powers, that is, the French, the Japanese, the French again, and finally the Americans, and to use communism to stop the landlords from viciously exploiting the farm labourers. I certainly did not want to kill them in order that my Australian government could reinforce the nuclear umbrella pact it had with the American government. At the time, that is the 1960s, the Australian government was having doubts about the commitment of the US government to truly defend Australia by dropping a nuclear bomb on some Asian nation, presumably China, which also had the nuclear bomb by then, by the way, if it decided to invade Australia. So the Australian government conscripted 20-year-old Australian males to risk their lives in the jungles of Vietnam to defend the beliefs of the old men of the Australian government. At the time, these 20-year-olds didn't even have the vote. I was outraged. No, it was stronger than that. I was murderous. I remember wandering the cemetery neighbouring my university college at night in paranoid rages, wondering how I could sneak grenades into the parliament to kill as many conscripting politicians as I could before being stopped. How dare they treat me as a piece of meat? How dare they force me to risk my life defending their ideologies that I flatly disagreed with? What a basic flouting of fundamental liberties. It's the mentality of the press gang. The Vietnam War and conscription radicalized a whole generation in the US and Australia and made conscription massively unpopular to the point that Western governments soon got rid of it. When parents with only 1 or 2 children lost a child to the Vietnam War, the loss was far greater than when parents in World War I lost a child who was one of many. My view of conscription is that it is criminal. I coined a slogan at the time, quote, "Conscription is an assassinable offence," meaning that any politician who conscripted would then be faced by people who felt that they had the moral right to assassinate him as the most effective way to stop the politician committing mass murder, that is, to stop him conscripting. I have a loathing of the continued existence of the military in nation-states. To me, the militaries are symbols of our intercultural ignorance and bigotry. When I see some visiting head of state being ceremoniously walked past an honour guard, that is, a row of soldiers with bayoneted rifles, I feel sick. I hope that the 21st century can outgrow these barbaric practices, these monuments to intercultural ignorance. I remember when I was 18, a fresher at university, watching a movie about World War I in which a French regiment in the trenches was ordered to go over the top in the face of overwhelming German machine gun fire. The young French soldiers, mostly conscripts, were mown down like flies. Only a few survived. I was ill for 3 days. So deep was the revulsion at what I saw. My reaction was, my God, that could have been me. Intellectually, I reasoned that the tragedy of World War I was the fact that millions of conscripts on one side were massacring millions of conscripts on the other side because their respective governments ordered them to, and being monos, they didn't have the presence of mind, nor a level of multi-consciousness to tell their politicians to go to hell. They were as mono as their political leaders. So, a deep-rooted part of me is sympathetic to the anarchists/libertarians. Nevertheless, I'm advocating the creation of a government, this time a global government, so I'll probably evoke the opposition of the anarchists. I anticipate this. I notice, for example, as I expressed somewhat in Chapter 2, that there's a correlation between the level of acceptance of the idea of a global government and which side of the Atlantic Ocean a native English speaker lives on. The British are more attuned to the idea of top brains going into politics, and hence making a global government more likely to be a success. The Americans, however, have a rather low opinion of their politicians, which sets up a vicious circle, because their best brains then do not go into politics. I've read books, not very good ones, written by Americans who distrust the idea of a world government, which they tend to see as creating a risk of a world dictatorship. Ad-libbing. I've changed my tune on that due to my increasing knowledge of the existence of the hated Jewish banksters. Remember, their agenda, their religion, is to fulfill the Talmudic prophecy, which is that the Jews will rule the world, their capital in Jerusalem, by committing as much evil as possible. That's their religion. They're Satanists, they're Shabbatian Frankists, technically speaking. And their belief is the more evil they can commit, the more likely the Jewish Messiah will come, conquer the Goy with the capital in Jerusalem, and then the Jews will wipe out the Goy and have the earth to themselves. Utterly diabolical and insane, but that's what they believe. So the idea of a democratic, globally democratic government is bitterly opposed by the idea of a hated Jewish bankster-dominated fascist state, the NWO, the New World Order. And so I have another hatred of the New World Order and the Jewish elite. They should be sent to The Hague and prosecuted and executed for their massive crimes against humanity. But I've spoken several times about this in this book, probably informally. Personally, I want to see a world government, but a democratic one, and one closely, very closely observed by the world population. I actively choose to have a world government managed by the world's best brains, since running the global state is the world's most important job. I loathe the nation state. I see it as a transitional barbarian state on the way towards a more civilized global state. By being a global state, it could get rid of the truly negative aspects of the nation state, particularly the impulse to wage war and to conscript. By being truly globally democratic, it could not be a dictatorship. A highly educated and critically minded global population would not tolerate it. Any global politician who tried to become a Hitler, a Stalin or a Mao would be quickly assassinated, and appropriately so. A global state is supposed to render impossible any future mass murder of many tens of millions of people that the great dictators of the 20th century committed. So insisting that the global state that I expect to see emerge in the 21st century be strongly democratic should take the wind out of the sails of the anarchists. Agreed, a global government is still a government, but by being strongly democratic and chosen to exist by the world's population, it need not of necessity be oppressive, as, I understand, anarchists think all governments are, by the very nature of governments. A truly global government will be subject to the requirements of a global population, capable of innovative democratic reforms, keeping the global politicians in line. In a future global population of 10 billion people, 1% of that number, that is the intellectual elite, is still 100 million intellectuals. Is that true? 10 billion, that's 10 to the 10, so 10 to the 8, that's 100 million, yeah, correct. Is still 100 million intellectuals. Surely that many thinking creative minds can dream up effective ways to keep their politicians from oppressing them, even to a small degree. If a truly global state, in a truly global state, I think anarchism as a political philosophy will pass into the history of philosophy books. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 7, so I'll stop here. Next chapter, chapter 8, is called Routes to Globa. So how to get to Globa.